Thank you, thank you. It's a real privilege to be here in Newcastle. Newcastle is where God spoke to me. I was playing in the youth team for Wolverhampton Wanderers. And we came up to St. James's Park in the early 1980s to play against the youth team at Newcastle. They beat us 8-0. And it was God saying to me, this isn't your calling. There's something else for you. So thank you, Newcastle. I'm here because of that castle on the hill. And no, it's a real pleasure to be with you. I feel like I've already been blessed already with the service that we had this morning, the wonderful speaker who spoke spoke this morning. It really was a powerful message about environmentalism, unfolding environmental justice into racial justice. Thank you for that. We've already been blessed by having Sharon Prentice give us that first message already. And in the Pentecostal church from which I come from, that means you can go home. See, once you've already been blessed, you go home. So those of you who want to, I'm just joking, you need to stay for this particular session. I need to apologize before I get started. I haven't started my 25 minutes yet because I'm Pentecostal. So let me apologize for two things. First of all, as a Pentecostal, when we're asked to do something, we prepare for an hour. Just in case, an hour and an altar call for 30 minutes. So I got into Pentecostal mode when I was preparing this, and it's slightly too long than what I planned. The other apology is because I'm also part of the new neoliberal university system, where we have to give students value for money. So again, you see, I packed everything in because I thought it was a classroom session where you have to give as much information as possible for the £93 per hour that every student is spending, and 15 minutes afterwards for questions. So there's far too much information in this, so I'm going to have to go through it slightly more quickly than I would have wanted to. So I'm going to, you can press the start button now for my 25 minutes, and I'm going to keep an eye on this, my watch, just in case the Spirit says, you know, these Anglican folk really want to go Pentecostal this morning. You just give them another 45 minutes and maybe even have that altar call. After all, because you know, I won't do that, don't worry. We'll be all right with that. I want you to go rogue. I want you to go rogue. We'll come back to that at the end. What if racism never ends? What do we got? Oh, we got the clicker. Here we go. What if racism never ends? What I want to do is talk through. Let me just make sure. There we go. That's just me. I'm just telling you the things that I do. I'm currently the professor of climate and social justice at the University of Winchester. I work at the Queen's Ecumenical Foundation. I do some work with them where I'm the professor of black theology. And then just to keep my hand in with our European friends post-Brexit, I work at VU University in Amsterdam where I'm an assistant professor of theology there as well. But nobody in Birmingham actually knows me for any of that stuff because they know me as a filmmaker. I've spent the last 25 years working for BBC Channel 4 and Discovery USA. So that's where most people know me. So when people bump into me on the street in Birmingham, they don't know anything about my day job. It's just something that they've seen me do in terms of the media. My next film, I need to advertise this, is being released in the West End. If you want to come along, it's called After Noah, Christianity, Slavery, and Reconciliation. If you want to come along, there's still some free tickets for that. George Clooney will be there, along with Beyonce. I'm just joking. George Clooney won't be there. Don't quote me on that. Some people go, oh my goodness. I'll make sure no, you won't be there. We've got a look-alike, George Clooney. Right, okay, so just in case. I come from one of the great cathedral towns, Coventry, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute, Coventry Cathedral, because Coventry Cathedral was in the city centre, but the church that I went to was across the road. It's a black church tradition, you see. I'm going to do an interplay between these two traditions, the church tradition of the cathedrals in the Anglican church, the black church tradition. And what I want to do is work through 4 areas with you. I want to talk about 2 schools of thought. I'm going to borrow from my African-American brothers and sisters on this, for part of this. I want to talk about 2 traditions that are currently at war with each other in black studies, black theology, and much of black life. There's traditions of optimism and pessimism. And normally when we talk about these within the church, we go with the optimism tradition. We're not going to do that. I was told that this is a radical city to be in Newcastle. I should go with the pessimism tradition. So we're going to work with the pessimism tradition just for the sake of producing a critique this morning. I'm going to talk about some key themes in black pessimism. I'm going to talk a little bit about fugitivity. It's all right, you can use this when you go back to your place. You say, what did we learn? Oh, well, this is about fugitivity. Oh, well, it's a little sound. What does that mean? And then we're going to talk about fugitivity in gospel music, because one of the mediums which I'm working is with gospel music, with media. I'm going to show how this is played out in music, and then I'm going to talk about what does it mean for cathedral spaces? What does it mean to make these spaces of fugitivity? It's about going rogue. You may need to go rogue within the Anglican communion, within the Church of England. It may require you to go rogue. Okay, let's just press on then. Look, I just want to talk, what's the background then to talking about Afro-pessimism, Afro-optimism? A good place to start with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and the whole idea of what's the best way to go for black people within the modern world from the 1960s onwards. And often these two traditions are presented as diametrically opposed, but in reality they merge in various areas. There are scholars who write about how these two traditions come together. They're not completely diametrically opposed, but for the sake of producing the critique, we'll see them as oppositional. I just say that because there's bound to be somebody in here who's a King expert who's going to say, well, actually, well, I'm just saying I'm aware of that before we get going. Okay, the Optimism School then. The Optimism School is a tradition of King. And it means that we have to dream for a better world. And the dream can inspire us, and if that inspires us, we can make it, we can do it. It means that we have to work at it, though. We have to deal with the histories that shape us and the injustice that surrounds us. And as long as we're willing to do that, to work through the dream, we can be optimistic. It means we can hope for liberation. But there's another school, the Pessimism School. Pessimism School says, hold on a minute. Most black people face a nightmare future, given the persistence of racism. Can't dream about it. We've got to be realists about the predicament that we face. Just look at the metrics around housing, around education, around policing, around even issues within the Church of England. There's a certain permanence because we haven't dealt with the structures, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. Therefore, what's the way forward? Black people have to look to themselves. Or they have to find spaces and places where they can thrive and live, because the system outside isn't necessarily going to work for them. It isn't necessarily going to change. There are theological moorings to this. Now, you thought, oh my goodness, it's secular stuff. No, it's got roots in Scripture. We might think, for example, of Moses as part of the liberation tradition. The Hebrews suffering oppression. What does God do? God reaches down and liberates them. That's the optimism tradition, isn't it? God's going to deliver us. You have to believe that if you support Coventry City, by the way. God is going to deliver us. But then there's also the tradition of Hagar. Hagar. We'd talk about this in slightly different language now today, wouldn't she? You know, this young girl being given to this older man. We might say that's kind of an abusive situation, we might call it today. She escapes, and what does God do? God sends her back into that oppressive system, but says, I'm going to enable you to thrive. I will be with you. You're going to have the skill set necessary to make it, even within that situation that seems like it's deadly. You're going to experience life. You see, that's the pessimism tradition. We're in a hostile environment, but we're going to make it, and we're going to do some stuff that's going to give us life and well-being despite it. So there's a theological underpinning to these two traditions. There's also a contemporary dimension to them. One may think of, in terms of the optimism tradition, my old pal, used to be a pal of mine, he was left-wing back then. He's gone right to the right now, isn't he, old Tony Sewell? He knows where the money is. There's no money in the left, so you have to go to the right if you want to make some money. So the Commission for Race and Ethnic Disparities was in many respects a liberation tradition. It said black people in Britain can make it. The only limitations they face are cultural ones, are actually psychological ones. It's what's in their minds. They don't recognize they have the capacity. Part of this liberation tradition in many respects, although some people might read it in a slightly different way in terms of the Sewell report. The other position as well, into contemporary Britain, the pessimism tradition is found around what happened to Child Q. And people recognizing that that whole predicament isn't an aberration, but a reflection of a corrupt system. And therefore, we've got to be pessimistic. And pessimism doesn't necessarily mean that we're negative. We're just realists about the persistence of the injustice. And therefore, we're going to organize and operate around it as a consequence. So let's just talk, that's the first section. Let's just talk a bit more then about the Afro-pessimism. We're going to work with this, you know? Oh, so, all right, sorry, yes, sorry. Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, I was moving. See, that's a Pentecost, you see? Don't blame me, it's the tradition. Yeah, you see, it means if you stand still, you see, people don't think you've got the Spirit. You've got to be... Walk across the stage. You see, and the faster the better. That's the Holy Spirit. So I'm just raised by that tradition. I'm sorry. So we're going to work with the Afro-pessimism approach because I think we can learn from it and that it has implications for thinking about cathedral spaces. So let's just look at some of the key themes within this and work with me on this. It might be new to you, but let's work with it. One of the themes is social death. The Jamaicans responsible for this, the former Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson, wrote a book in the 1990s about the persistence of racism in America. And the argument being that slavery didn't necessarily end, it just evolved. Enslaved people experienced a form of social death, which Orlando Patterson believed continued into the present. So you may be alive as a human being, but socially, the limitations placed upon you mean that you're always confronting social death, forces of non-being. Michelle Alexander, the writer, criminologist, describes this process in terms of the criminal justice system and argues that, again, slavery didn't disappear, it just evolved into the 13th Amendment, the prison industrial complex, which disproportionately incarcerates, criminalizes African-American men. And we shouldn't get uppity about it because we incarcerate and criminalize a larger percentage of black and brown men in Britain than they do in North America. So we're really in trouble in that one. And again, if we go back to Child Q, you see, the argument would be, even if you are in a safe space, you still risk social death, as that child did within the school system. So that the argument would be there's an evolution of the injustice. It doesn't disappear, it just morphs into something else. Another thing, look, there's a theological root to this. One of my favorite pieces, when we explore this with students, we go back to, I'm Jamaican, you see, so everything's about Jamaica. You know, Jamaicans, everything. Barack Obama's Jamaican for us, you know. I mean, we claim everybody, anybody with Caribbean ancestry. Anyway, Zinzendorf goes to Jamaica, the 1830s, and he preached. I mean, this was the days before they gave offerings, right? Because you don't preach this kind of sermon and get a big offering from people. What does he say to enslaved people? He said, look, be true to your husbands and wives and obedient to your masters and overlord, bombers. The Lord has made all ranks, kings, masters, servants, and first of all, believing in the great chain of being, a hierarchy. Racial hierarchy. There's a system that makes you socially dead and you're at the bottom. God has punished the first Negroes by making them slaves and you're converted. So not only saying that there's a social hierarchy, but it's legitimated in Scripture. Working with that misinterpretation of the curse of Ham narrative where people thought Ham meant burnt. The word doesn't mean that, but it led to this doctrine, which I think the Southern Baptists only got rid of a few decades ago in the 1990s, where they believed that black people were perpetually condemned to servitude. He then goes on to say that, look, even if you do become converted, what's going to happen? All it's going to do is save you from yourselves, your inherent wickedness. This whole idea of social death has theological moorings that we have to address and unpack. Why is that important for us? Because in the British context, in the last 100 years, we've written 1.5 books addressing this history. John Wilkinson's A Church in Black and White, 1994. Ken Leach's work on the churches in racism in the 1990s. Only half of his book covers it. 1.5 books. My party piece with students, when you get old and you're an academic, you learn all these tricks to get the students out of the classroom. You go to the common room, have a coffee, read the paper, come back. You say it's blended learning or something like that. Talk about really sophisticated. We're going to do some blended learning. You come back. You see, I send them to the library and I say, look, how many books are written by English theologians discussed? 1.5. Fantastic. So you send them away. And they say, look, now go and find all the books written by the same demographic about being nice nice to animals, animal theology. They go away. It takes them about 45 minutes. Because I go see my friend next door, have a chat, see what's happening, look at the papers, put a few bets on the GGs. You know, you can do that within Pentecostalism, you see. Come back in. It's after 45 minutes. And they come back and they say, 55. I say to them, now, don't get me wrong. I hope that my pet rabbit, I hope that the degus the kids had, I hope the fish make it into heaven. But doesn't it suggest something awkward about an academic guild that has invested more time, energy, and resource into animal theology? Don't get me wrong, I'm pro-animal theology, than it has done addressing the church's 500-year sojourn with racial terror. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? You know, it's worrying stuff. Okay, so look, social death, we do know, has implications in the church in the contemporary age. I'm just going to play you a few seconds of a program that I helped to make for Panorama last year, where we examine how this social death then gets played out within the life of the church. I'm just going to play you a few minutes from the tease.
Tonight on Panorama.
Forgive us all that is past.
The Church of England's broken promises on race and racism.
There's a culture of fear where people pretend to be okay, but they're really battling. It makes you feel invisible. It makes you feel absolutely powerless.
We speak to clergy claiming discrimination.
Why would you, on a letter which is asking for a job opportunity, why would you draw attention to my ethnicity?
To the church's former top advisor on race relations.
Based on the racial reckoning of the church, I'm afraid they've abysmally failed, and it's not fit for purpose.
And the man who's been brought in to help change things.
The issue isn't so much that we haven't talked about it enough. The issue is that we haven't acted upon it enough.
But the church has been here before.
This is the important
look,
point.
Yeah, but you don't need to tell me.
But that does shame the church, doesn't it?
Well,
You see, Clive Myrie at the end there, it's part of the tease. You can still watch it. We've uploaded it on, it's online. At the end, 164 recommendations, and none of them enacted by the church. Again, this is social death. A system that suggests there's equality, inclusion, and justice, but fails to do it. It's social death. The second theme, I'm going to try and work through these quickly, is the normativity of anti-blackness. The whole idea of then, if you've got social death, anti-blackness is built into the world around you. A clear example of that is if you look at things around racial attack, the way in which we've racialized immigration. It gets kind of interesting, doesn't it? You know, we used to talk about we don't want the Syrians here, they're Muslims. Don't want the people coming from Afghanistan, they're Muslim. Well, the Ukrainians. Well, that's kind of different, isn't it? You know, everything takes on a different complexion because they look like us. When they said that, I said, well, I don't know how many black Ukrainians there are, but, it takes on. So anti-blackness gets built into the system. Second feature. Third feature then is we have to think about the failure of liberalism from Kant through to John Rawls. The idea that a liberal society will bring about justice and inclusion is challenged. It's failed because whether you look at Kant or Rawls, neither of them effectively dealt with issues of racial justice. Kant thought that black and brown people should be enslaved. Rawls didn't believe that justice should be projected backwards into the field of reparations. So within liberalism, two greatest thinkers in contemporary two greatest thinkers in world history around this, both fail on that issue. Leads black pessimists to say the system itself is faulty, it's problematic, it can't deliver. So what do we do within that space? We find places and spaces where we can refuse then this black death, refuse this anti-blackness, and what we create fugitive spaces, spaces where we can be outlaws, where we can be on the run, where we can escape the anti-blackness. This leads us into the third area, fugitivity. What does it mean then? There's a good book on this by Christina Sharp, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, which deals with what it means to create fugitive spaces through wake work. Why wake work? Because the wake is not only what we do when people die, mourning. The wake is also the wake of a slave ship for Christina Sharp. And we live in that wake with its repercussions, with its ruffle. So how do we then go about doing this fugitivity? And what I'm going to do is show you how I've attempted to explore it in my own work in terms of gospel music. I have an album out, which came out a few years ago. I was raised by a Marxist math teacher. And so you can't do anything for profit in my house, I'm telling you. It's just so I got these artists together, did the whole, and it has to be social enterprise. So it's a social enterprise. So you can download it for free, and that's a problem, with left-wing politics. There's no profit in it, And I say to the kids, become tourists. Got to make some money. So how do we then deal with these issues? One of the tracks from the album is called Incarnation, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. It juxtaposes the power of the incarnation as an affirmation of the value of all flesh with the post-war experience of discrimination. Why do we do that? We do resolve it in the end. Obviously, it's a dialectic. We find a way of pulling it together. We do that in the song because one of the things that we have to do to create these fugitive spaces, to think critically about this, is to mourn that past, is to address it. We can't ignore it. I'll just play you a few minutes of this because I don't know how I'm doing for time. How am I doing for time? About 10 minutes.
In 1954, about 10,000 West Indians came to Britain. In 1955, it is believed another 15,000 will make the long journey. Already their coming has caused a national controversy, but one point must always be borne in mind. Whatever our feelings, we cannot deny the mention. For all are British citizens, and as such, are entitled to the identical rights of any member of the Empire.
John chapter 1. No, the one where the world turn man. Him come live amongst we. Come live amongst we. No, the one where the world turn man. Him come live amongst we.
John 1:14 tells the story of Jesus' incarnation, that the Word becomes flesh and lives amongst us. It means that God, who is fully God and fully man, takes on human form. The incarnation means that unequivocally all creation is good, and that all flesh, no matter what color, no matter what tone, is good. My parents believed in this meaning of the incarnation, that their flesh was good. They were immigrants from Jamaica who came to work in Britain after the Second World War. But they soon came to realize that not everybody thought the same. When they went to look for places to live, they were greeted with signs that said, "No blacks, no Irish, and no dogs."
Sail 5,000 miles with the sun way up behind me. They said it's gonna be a while till I feel that warm again. Staring at the gray skies as the cold rain starts to soak me. Faces that I recognize, but no one I call a friend. Just one place above, how my father set before me. Still no wise about the days that lay ahead. Hands and feet are free.
Okay, you get a gist of how it works. So the whole of the song is a pullout of these issues of these examples of state violence. What we're trying to do is suggest that, look, we've got to make sense of this. We have to mourn this past and think about what it means in terms of the incarnation, God becoming flesh. Fugitive space requires us to address this issue. We specialize in Britain in what the great dean of sociology, of cultural studies, Stuart Hall, called selective historical amnesia. We're actually really good at forgetting this 500-year history, and therefore we don't reflect on it, we don't think about it, and we don't respond to it. Anybody here who's done any theological study will know that when you do church history, after you've done the Renaissance and the Reformation, you just jump into liberal theology. This 500-year history of what Britain did overseas, what the church completely omitted. So one of the reasons why we can't do this work is that we've been failed by our theological educators. We haven't had the whole history. The historiography is problematic. Second song is called Magnificat, because what we wanted to do was have a song that would celebrate black women in particular, because we recognize that the church, the black church, is a women's movement. I don't know how it works with an Anglicanism, but it's a women's movement. So in terms of thinking about fugitivity, not only did we wanted to celebrate the life-giving forces that there are out there in our community and within our churches. So this song is about reworking Mary's Magnificat. Remember, the Magnificat is about the great reversal tradition, the high being brought down, the weak being exalted. And so what we did with this track was think about that idea in terms of the visuals, and the visuals tell the story of Nanny of the Maroons. That's a Caribbean history, a freedom fighter in 18th century Jamaica, who was so successful that the British signed a peace treaty with her brother, Cudjoe, and led to a whole tradition of maroonage or marinage in the Caribbean. So the figure in the middle represents Nanny. And then we asked Rose Hudson Wilkins. That was before she made Bishop, you see. I don't know if she would have done it now, you know what I mean? But, she's been up there. You have to get them when they're young and struggling, to participate. So we got Rose Hudson Wilkins in it to help us create a narrative around black women's empowerment. And then the other visual dimension of this deals with aesthetics, because one of the struggles around affirming black life is how you look and loving blackness in all of its colors and shades, but particularly the darker shades. So we play with that idea with some of the imagery. I'm going to do a few minutes of this and then go on to the last one.
I believe we need to hear more women's voices in public life, in particular for the next generation. If we're going to change the dynamics of what we have today, where it is still sort of a man's world, then women today need to step forward to enable their children and their grandchildren, in particular girls, and actually boys too. Boys need to see that their counterparts can be equally respected in terms of the contribution that they bring to the table.
Luke chapter 1.
May God bless woman, because the most powerful God do the miracle here for me. Him only God good can done. Oh him ladies, oh him girls, because God has chosen you to save the world. Oh black women of the earth, feel like dirt, you need to know your worth.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. You see, what we did was we went to all the black hair, care and beauty events across the country for a whole year and just took pictures of black women with dark skin and natural hair. Why? Because that's seen as the most problematic in the world outside. So how do we then show that we're affirming black life by celebrating dark-skinned black women with natural hair? You see, so again, playing with this idea of fugitivity, affirming black life in spaces of non-being. The third one, example I'm going to give you. How am I doing for time? Am I 5 minutes? Okay, that's good. I tell you, that's good for a Pentecostal. I tell you, that's break a record here. Third example, I'm just going to finish with this, is from a track called Resurrection. And what we wanted to do as well was affirm something that you rarely see on British television. And if you want an explanation of that, I can tell you later on. I've been working in television for 25 years. Seeing black people in love, deeply problematic mainstream television. You can't have black people. I've tried to pitch drama programs on this with superstar people. Couldn't get it done because they wouldn't allow us to show black people in love. So again, how do we create a fugitive space that resists the anti-blackness, the social death, a place that affirms black love?
Luke chapter 24.
Why make no look for the one where I live, amongst the one them were dead? Him not there. Him come back alive. Him come back alive.
Resurrection, revolution, Christ is
I'm not gonna. These are all you can download and watch. All of these are all online. Like I said, I was raised not to make money out of these things, so they're all. So what does this all mean then? In terms of thinking about cathedral space, well, look, I think we have to wrestle with the history of the church's complicity with racial terror. Have to wrestle with that. Has to be foregrounded and explored, and we need to develop a language around it so we can talk about it without feeling embarrassed. We've got to address that. Need to develop that language. Secondly, I think we've got to offer an alternative vision, a version of the Christian story. There is more than one interpretation of how Jesus Christ works within the world. And maybe part of that is exploring the grotesque within the Christian story as well as the heroic within it, but also telling the parts of the Christian story that we have selectively omitted. You know, in terms of Caribbean history, Asian church history, representing all of God's children and all of God's children's experience within this place. And also, I think we have to make sure that these cathedral spaces then refuse Black death, affirm Black life. And these three things are what I mean by going rogue. Because my sense is, if the cathedral space is connected to the rest of the space within the Church of England, and if that dynamic is similar to the rest of British society, then to create fugitive spaces means you have to go against the grain. Means you have to go against what's normative. So to end with, I really encourage you to go rogue. Go rogue. Thank you. I forgot to say, final thing, sorry, I had one last slide, which is to say, actually, there is an equivalent of this tradition within English Christian history. It's a tradition of sanctuary, where the churches operated as sanctuary for exiles, for people seeking refuge. So what I've talked about isn't a million miles away from one of the radical traditions within the Church of England.